Good afternoon, everyone. A really warm welcome to you all. My name is Vicky Brotherton. I'm Head of Policy Engagement and Impact at the Rights Lab. We're really grateful that you're joining us for the launch of this scoping review of modern slavery prevalence estimation methods. I'm going to shortly drop a link into the chat to the report that's just gone live this morning. We have an hour together today. I'm going to be shortly handing over to the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Eleanor Lyons, who commissioned and funded this research. Eleanor then will pass on to Professor Todd Landman, who is the Research Director at the Rights Lab and lead author on this report, and he's going to provide you an overview of some of the findings. We should then have about 15-20 minutes for a Q&A. You might notice that there's a Q&A function at the top of the call, also a chat function as well. Please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A function as the presentations are ongoing so that we can collate them and ask them at the end. You'll notice that your camera and microphone are currently switched off. This is just to really limit noise interference. But if you would like to ask a question at the end verbally in the Q&A, please just use the raise hand function and we'll come to you and unmute you. Just to say that we have people with learned and lived experience of modern slavery on the call today. So please can I remind you just to be mindful of this, be respectful and considerate in the questions that you ask. We don't intend to speak directly about experience of exploitation today, but we will obviously be discussing the general theme of modern slavery. So please take care of your well-being, step out of the call at any time if needed. Final piece of housekeeping is just really to let you know that we are recording this session. We intend to record the whole hour, but we will only share the presentations and not the Q&A. Okay, enough from me. Let me hand over, please, to the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Eleanor Lyons.
Thank you, Vicky. And what a good way to start Anti-Slavery Week with this call and this report, which is so important. For those of you who I haven't met on the call, I'm Eleanor Lyons. I'm the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. And my role is to promote and encourage good practice in preventing modern slavery and supporting victims. And a key part of my work is improving how we understand the problem through high quality research, better data, and robust analysis. And that is why I commissioned this new scoping review. Because without a clear picture of prevalence of modern slavery in the United Kingdom, who is affected, where and how, we cannot identify victims and fulfil our moral obligations and our legal obligations to them, or target our resources effectively against the perpetrators of this crime. As many of you will know, one of the most prominent data sources we have currently is the National Referral Mechanism, or as we commonly call it, the NRM. It tells us how many potential victims have been identified and referred for support in the UK. But as many of you know, the NRM has its limitations. It gives us only one part of the picture. It reflects to us those who have come to the attention of authorities, but not those who remain hidden, exploited, unidentified, or too fearful or mistrustful of the authorities to engage with the system. It's why we don't want to rely solely on what the NRM shows us, or we risk misunderstanding the true scale and nature of exploitation. And if we don't know where people are being exploited or which communities are most at risk, we cannot design policy interventions that reach the right people at the right time. And I think that's why the work that you will hear about today is so important. Rather than trying to find one definite number, definitive thing that we can point to, this research rightly asks how we can use data, some of which we already have, to better understand prevalence. How can we apply different methodologies and technologies to uncover what's currently hidden, to estimate risk in specific regions or communities, and to learn more about the different forms of exploitation that are taking place. As you will hear today, this is not about choosing a single methodology. It's about understanding the range of tools that are available and how they can be applied in different ways to different questions and provide us the answers that we need. And this is more than just identifying harm that's already happening. Crucially, this research helps us to look ahead, to look to the future. If we can identify patterns of risks, vulnerable locations or groups, we can act earlier. We can design prevention strategies that stop exploitation before it even takes place or takes hold, before it steals futures and shatters lives. As traffickers and exploiters are becoming more sophisticated, we must equally be as determined, equally innovative in how we choose to disrupt them. We must be relentless in preventing harm as they are in causing it. And that means using data and research not only to respond, but also to anticipate. You will hear more shortly about the report's recommendations, including the value of creating a national modern slavery and human trafficking data hub to break down silos and enable ethical joined-up analysis across agencies. This is the kind of infrastructure that we need if we are to build a truly strategic, evidence-led response, a response that can adapt as the threat evolves. Because ultimately, this work is about ensuring that victims and survivors are seen, supported, and protected. And it's also about making sure we are not one step behind those who exploit. So today, I want to urge all of you who are listening, policymakers, practitioners, researchers, to think beyond headline numbers. Think about what it would mean to apply these methods, which we're going to discuss today, to truly unlock the data that we have and to use it not only to count victims of modern slavery, but to use it to prevent victimization in the first place. And this is what this research enables us to do. So thank you very much for your time today. And I'm going to hand you over to the fantastic Professor Todd Landman from the Rights Lab, who's going to speak through his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and thank you, Vicky. I have to say there was a large team behind this work, so I'm very pleased to share some of the highlights of what we discovered in our research for this scoping review. So first of all, it's important for us just to set out what the aims of the study were, and that was to map existing prevalence estimations on modern slavery that have been used across the world, to assess the strengths and weaknesses of those methods and understand stakeholder views within the UK, as well as consider which methods are best for future prevalence estimates within the UK. Now, we did this by reviewing extant studies across the world, of which we looked at 46 different studies. We assessed their strengths and weaknesses in terms of their reliability and validity. And we met with the IAS Data Advisory Group and many other stakeholders. We surveyed stakeholders from a wide range of organizations, and we'll show you some of the results from that survey across 93 people, and held workshops with public sector CEOs, deputy CEOs, as part of the Cabinet Office Leadership Government, College for Government, and a collation of data sources that already exist that can be used both for direct and indirect assessment of modern slavery in the UK. Now, the key challenge that we set out in this report is that any kind of effort at measuring modern slavery and estimating prevalence has to overcome the fundamental problem of unobservability, which means that modern slavery practices are rarely seen. However, they are very much experienced, and victims and survivors are often unheard and hidden. Now, there are methodological solutions to this problem of unobservability, and we highlight those in the report. Now, previous estimations started in 2014 with using what's called multiple systems estimation, and I'll be talking about that later. Then a series of survey extrapolations from the Walk Free Foundation that actually did analysis outside the UK, but then extrapolated numbers into the UK. A very promising study in the West Midlands that used natural language processing. However, you'll see the range of estimates goes from 8,300 to 136,000, and currently we argue there's no national consensus on the number. Now, the basic data analysis process that we look at is some combination of taking a sample of information that is known, capturing data from that sample, drawing inferences from that sample, and then estimating prevalence with some degree of precision. It's really important to stress that any kind of estimation comes with a degree of uncertainty, and the statistical methods that we reviewed and the approaches that we looked at all concern themselves with reducing that uncertainty, but accept that uncertainty is the norm, which is to say that any prevalence estimation will always be expressed as a range within which the true value lies. Now, the overview that we've presented within this review of the methods includes multiple systems estimation, some combination of sampling and survey approaches, the natural language processing example from the West Midlands, and the potential for out-of-sample projections using machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now, as in any review, these come with assumptions, they come with strengths, and they come with limitations. So multiple systems estimation requires on independent administrative lists of victims the capability for record linkage across those different sources and assume a closed system of victims. It is a relatively cost-effective and efficient method. However, it does have a number of requirements for it to be successful. It's often the case that the independence of lists, that assumption is often violated. With sampling and survey approaches, it's some combination of sampling strategies that are related to the research questions under observation or under inquiry, as Eleanor has said, a well-designed survey instruments with appropriate indicators required for each type or offense within modern slavery language. And we know that survey costs are relatively high and more time-consuming. And optionally, there is a method called network scale-up that should be used with caution, but is an indirect way of realizing prevalence estimation. The natural language process in the West Midlands involved using text and language from police records and then applying machine learning to that corpus of text. However, it too was based on a number of assumptions about the availability of the text, the completeness of the raw corpus, the lexicon that was used to analyze that corpus. It also assumed a uniform rate of offense and then scaled up to the rest of the UK. And of course, it didn't quite take into account the observation that some people identified in the West Midlands may have been victims in other parts of the UK. So that kind of closed system question. And finally, machine learning and AI techniques mean that smaller samples of data on specific modern slavery offenses can be collected and then used to extrapolate to other geographical regions. Now, let me just go in a little bit of depth here on the multiple systems estimation process. It starts with a list of known victims and then engages in data matching and record linkage to build a unified database of victims from which you can then make estimations and inferences. The assumptions behind this are that you may have a sample of people, call it A, who've been reported, a sample of people, call it B, who've been reported, and these might be two lists that are produced. And the orange figures show that there are some victims who would be in an overlap between those two sources. The gray figures on the outside are those that are not captured by any one source, and there are probabilities associated with people being reported into list A, list B, and being caught by both lists or in that overlap, which we call M. Now, this method has been used throughout human rights research. It featured in truth commissions around the world, for example, in Peru. It featured in Sierra Leone, East Timor, and the method itself goes right back to the 19th century in the use in environmental studies and in counting fish, for example. However, the Human Rights Data Analysis Group in California, originally based at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, have used this method across a number of truth commissions, and the most recent report combined 106 different data sets in the case of Colombia. Now, the essence of this method takes information that we know about particular victims to estimate the unknown victims and then a total estimation. It's been applied in the UK in 2014. It's been applied in the Netherlands, in Romania, and in the city of New Orleans in the United States. Now, currently, the data ingestion process within the NRM, as Eleanor referred to, takes two sources, let's say, of information and merges them into a single record of a victim. And this process has been digitalized more recently. And what we propose in our review is that it might be a great idea to keep that decision open in the first instance. So if a victim is reported by source A and source B, it's important to retain both of those sources within any one row within the NRM. Then we can look at how those records are linked, unlinked, whether those sources were independent from one another or not, and that would give us much more insight into whether MSE could be used in the future for another estimation within the UK. Now, the second method we looked at was sampling and surveys. Here, there's a similar data process which involves understanding your target population, deriving and designing a sampling strategy, designing a survey, collecting the data, and then making an estimate. Now, there's a lot to choose from here. In terms of sampling strategies, have everything from probability and random samples to unequal probability to stratified samples, all the way through link tracing samples, line point transects, a number of options for us that have all been used in different estimation projects around the world, depending on the target population and the research questions that inform the study. Within survey design, there's typically a module of demographic questions, multiple lateral modern slavery indicator questions, depending on the focus of a study, then context-specific questions, possibly translation into multiple languages, and then optionally the use of network scale-up questions, which probe a respondent's understanding of the size of their own personal network and the likely victims they may know within that personal network. Apologies, that advanced too quickly. Finally, there are appropriate estimators to use depending on the sample, the type of sample that was used, as well as whether n-sum was used, which then lead to an estimate with its lower and upper bound using the language of statistics there. Okay, so the last part of the report really looks at how could we move beyond prevalence. We had a discussion with the IS Data Advisory Group, and a lot of what we were talking about really involved looking at risk and vulnerability rather than counting people, as it were. And there's a real opportunity for us to move beyond prevalence and develop data modeling strategies that can estimate and demonstrate the risks as either as a whole or across different modern slavery offenses. Now, IASC had already commissioned a piece of work on the multiple and overlapping vulnerabilities across individuals, which can be collected at the individual level using already existing data, or at the aggregate level using already existing data. Now, all of this could be aided by greater availability to data, continued investment in the UK's data infrastructure, which is already quite rich and robust, and continued development of new innovative research methods and data analytic techniques, one of which includes geospatial layering using high spatial resolution across the whole of the UK, and I'll provide a little example of what that might look like. So our review of data sources, 57 in total, really could be divided between those that are direct and indirect and broken down into administrative, survey, and external organizations. And those are listed in the appendix of the report and discussed in greater detail. But what about this data layering process for geospatial analysis? The Rights Lab's done some work in another country context and where this has become a quite useful exercise for us to understand the risks and vulnerabilities of particular modern slavery offenses. Now, there are three ways of doing this. One is to build a data set that incorporates latitude, longitude, and actual altitude measures in a kind of rectangular data structure with geocoding address systems using Google codes, postcodes, or some of you may know the what three words system, which actually identifies precise locations, and descriptive information. So for the UK, that could include a constituency name, a locality name, a protected area, a mountain peak, etc. The second kind of layering that can take place uses vector points, which are topological abstract representations of individual locations, marking of a house on a map, or lines that connect points to show paths or boundaries like roads or rivers, and polygons that connect multiple points to outlying areas like city limits, lakes, or even ports. And finally, the raster formats digital photos into almost a gridded matrix of pixels covering a specific map area. And here we can use satellite imagery, coverage of farm fields from model data. And then those things are layered at different levels of aggregation within one analysis. And then we could actually see what the risks and vulnerabilities are within the United Kingdom at quite a high level of spatial resolution or locational specificity. Now, additionally, there are two methods under exploration at the University of Birmingham by Dr. Roland Seymour. The first is comparative judgment, where selections of subject matter experts make judgments about the level of modern slavery offenses across pairs of units of analysis. And he conducted a really interesting pilot study in Nottinghamshire around forced marriage in different electoral wards. And effectively, these panel of experts judge whether they think the offense rate is higher in one unit versus another, and then you can aggregate all those judgments into a risk map or a risk statement that is geographically differentiated. The second area under explanation is crime linkage, which really focuses on perpetrators. So it flips everything on its head in a sense and tries to link one or two perpetrators to one or more offenses and looks for behavioral consistency and behavioral distinctiveness. And we think that both of these methods should be explored further for application within the United Kingdom. Now, finally, part of our stakeholder survey across 93 people revealed this rather interesting graphic, which breaks down the reasons and demand for prevalence studies from different organizations across the UK. And we've broken these into research institutes, central government departments, politicians and parliamentarians, voluntary organizations, etc. Across understanding the nature and extent of modern slavery, whether we use this as raising awareness for advocacy purposes, policy making, assessing the effectiveness of interventions, for further research or other reasons. Now we see that folks who represented central government actually had quite a high bar for thinking about assessing effectiveness of interventions. So in reflection of what Eleanor said in her opening comments, really knowing the true nature and extent of this problem does allow us to understand allocation of resources as well as the effectiveness of interventions. Research institutes also rate very highly further research purposes, but also advocacy efforts. Now I'm going to hand over to Vicky, who's going to work through some of the methodological and larger recommendations that we make at the end of the report.
Thanks so much, Todd. Okay, so in terms of recommendations, then we broke them down, as Todd said, into methodological and then wider recommendations for government. The recommendations regarding methods were that we think multiple systems estimation is the most cost efficient and least biased method for estimating prevalence of modern slavery in its umbrella form. To undertake MSE, we would suggest using the NRM data held by the Home Office, alongside other data sources such as the local authority data held on potential victims who choose not to be referred into the NRM. As Todd previously kind of explained, to be able to use the NRM data that's held by the Home Office for MSE, there needs to be a change to the current NRM case management system so that multiple referrals for the same person are no longer immediately merged into a single record, so that the record of the different sources of those referrals is maintained. We think that to estimate prevalence of specific kinds of modern slavery offences across different subgroups within the UK, we think the best method would be sampling and survey approaches. It's important that these studies adhere to the kind of key principles of sampling and survey design, such as being very clear in specifying the type of modern slavery offence that is being measured, having a well-defined target population, and including survivors and those with lived experience in the co-design of the survey. And finally, in terms of methods, we think the UK should produce triennial estimations of modern slavery prevalence, so essentially having prevalence estimate done every 3 years. And we've suggested 3 years because we think that undertaking an annual prevalence estimate might be unlikely, really, for time and cost reasons. But a triennial estimate every 3 years would still be frequent enough to still enable useful comparisons across the years. In terms of recommendations for government, so in addition to the recommendation we made to the Home Office about changing the NRM case management system, we have made some potentially ambitious recommendations to the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, or DSIT, through its government digital service. We think it could establish a modern slavery and human trafficking data warehouse to essentially house public and potentially private data sets relevant to understanding modern slavery, which would be really helpful in terms of supporting inter-agency data sharing, collating and analysis of relevant data. And we think that this data warehouse could form part of the government's plans to establish a national data library. And the second recommendation is in kind of recommending that, again, DSIT, through its government digital service, could also engage in building modern slavery risk maps. As Todd said, there seems to be a vast number of relevant data sources that could be used and that we know exist to provide this greater understanding of the economic, demographic and social geographies of modern slavery risk. And that could really help inform policy development and resource allocation. So those are the kind of the recommendations, and that kind of brings us to the end of the summary of the research, we just wanted to mention a special thanks to these individuals and groups who have helped us with this research. You know, we've consulted with them, they've provided us their expert guidance and advice, and they've helped think through kind of the research method. So we're really grateful to you all. So that brings us to the end of the kind of formal presentations.